this is in inverted commas, I want to say something first for a moment about my concerns that the current opportunity for political reform will be wasted. All the signs are that political parties will manage their way through the current pressure for real political reform on the government side by sitting mute, and on the opposition side by kicking this hot potato off into the long grass to constitutional conventions or citizens' assemblies. They have all been prominent, all the parties, in talking the talk and speaking much about the need for wholesale constitutional reform, and sounding radical by talking of citizens' assemblies or constitutional conventions. Apart from superficial proposals on relatively minor aspects of our political system, the length of the presidency, the titles of all committees, the parties have avoided addressing the detail of political reform. Suggesting that some constitutional review group or all-party committee should examine the matter has been the device repeatedly deployed by political parties of all descriptions to park or long-finger political reform. Instead of making big decisions, the politicians want to set up a big committee. The best way to avoid to sound radical but avoid doing anything to talk about root and branch reconfiguration of our whole constitutional system. I said that here in 2009, and I think we have to start with the operating conclusion that the opportunity presented by the economic crisis has been wasted. 3 years now into the crisis, our politics is operating in precisely the same way it did 3 years ago. Every single word of our Constitution is the same. Our Dáil is still ineffective. Our backbenchers are entirely powerless. Our executive is completely dominant. And nothing significant has changed in our political system. And nothing significant is going to change in our political system until we change. Those who want to campaign for political reform change the way they approach it. In the twice-annual meetings on the writings of Pat MacGill that Joe Mulholland and I usually hold in some South Dublin hostilleries, he has often said to me, "Why come you're so set against political reform?" And which my response always is, "No, Joe, I'm not against political reform. I'm against these vague, generalised, grand constitutional schemes about political change, because I've been around the system long enough to know they never happen. And if they haven't happened now on foot of this dramatic economic crisis, I'm convinced they will never happen, and the answer is for a more gradual, peaceful, effective reform of our political system by changing standing orders, changing practices, changing legislation. In political reform, as much as anything else, we've suffered here at MacGill and elsewhere from what Eddie Malloy in other contexts is called an implementation deficit. The people who have to implement it are the incumbents. They want to get elected, so of course they'll talk in grand terms about political and constitutional reform. The grander they can talk about it, the less specific they have to be. But when they get into power, all politicians follow a well-worn path. It's always the same. All of the parties sign up for political constitutional change before the election. They say, we'll do it within months. Get in, it immediately slows down. It takes a year, 18 months, even to set up the bodies to explore the constitutional political change. They're given a year to explore the task, which inevitably becomes another 18 months. And then, lo and behold, we think, we can't do that now, there's an election coming. And literally, that's the context we're at. I'm sorry if that's a depressing basis on which to start your deliberations at this part of your week. As it happens, I'm stuck elsewhere tomorrow, so I've gone out of town. But I wanted, in a sense, to leave that point behind you. It's time to stop talking about the great, vague, big constitutional transformation schemes and focus on those things which will change, which could change, some of which I flagged here before and will flag again in a moment. I want to thank Joe Mulholland for the invitation to speak again this year. I want to thank him for putting together an impressive programme of speakers, which I hope will delay at least for a week the onset of the annual silly season, because by offering substantial and significant topics and a serious range of speakers, he has always managed, in a sense, to be that buffer after the parliamentary term ends. If anything, of course, he's overloaded the week again. Mark Hennessy, when he used to cover the MacGill Summer School, once described it as a holiday for the mind, which I see MacGill has picked up in its advertising slogan. I last year described it as a boot camp for the mind, and every year Joe is trying to exhaust us more. I want to thank the weather, because it means it's so wet outside. You have to come in and sit here and listen to the likes of myself and Frank. And having made that general point about political reform, which I turn to in a moment, I want to look at some of the specifics briefly that flow from the particular theme Joe has asked us to discuss, and that is the implications which the recent spate of corruption revelations, tribunal reports, will have for our political system. And you see, I tend to come to MacGill and give a view, not what I think should happen. I probably feel Fianna Fáil should survive last year. I said it won't. I probably feel the revelations about corruption should have an impact on our political system. I'm fairly convinced it won't. I'm fairly convinced it won't. This is where I distinguish between the vague theory and the should and down to the practicality. It's worth remembering. It's worth remembering what has brought about the collapse of Fianna Fáil and the volatility and transformation in our electoral system reflected in the result of the February 2011 election was the economic crisis, not corruption revelations. There have been a series of tribunal reports. People used to think when Vincent Browne first started as a late-night radio presenter, where he could do less harm, and he reconstructed the various tribunal proceedings at the first phase of what was then the flood tribunal. Everybody said, this is just going to blow the election wide open. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. When Geraldine Kennedy and Colin McKenna first published the David McKenna letter, that was the first revelation around Bertie Ahern's financials, followed up with stories and revelations from Frank Connolly and others, some of them from within the private deliberations of the tribunal. Coming in to the following elections, everybody says, this has to be the undoing of Bertie Ahern. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. It ultimately did, as the tribunal tried to walk through his finances, and effectively ultimately checkmated him because his explanations got so preposterous that he had to resign before he could go in the witness box and say he had won the last tranche of it on a horse. So it had that impact, but it didn't change any electoral outcomes. It didn't change any electoral outcomes. It is the economy, stupid. Bad economic management will do for politicians. Revelations, concerns or suspicions about the nature of their personal financial dealings and or corruption will not. That has been the lesson of Irish politics in Tipperary North. I suspect, if need be, in Wexford. That has been the tradition in national and local elections. And that, to hold that mirror that Justin talked about this morning, is something we have to look back and say, what is it about the Irish people that when given the choice between 2 or 3 different candidates interviewing for the job, they go for the ones who they think will be more able rather than necessarily the ones they think will be more proper. And that's why I'm not convinced that the corruption revelations will have much impact on our political system, on the way our politics operate. It should, and I know many will set out the reasons of all this week in more detail and better than I can as to why it should. My only concern in trying to analyse things going forward is whether it will. After that, then apart from that, I want briefly just to do a couple of other things, and in some ways not as a political analyst, but as a lawyer. And I think when one looks at the corruption, in particular the crime of corruption, it's important to understand a number of things. I appreciate and understand the genuine and justified public anger at the slow pace of investigations into corporate crime generally, corruption-type crimes in this country. As I said, the frustration is understandable. I'm conscious that I'm speaking in the afternoon where there have been significant arrests around one of those investigations, in case you missed it at lunchtime, so I don't want to delve too much into some of that area. But I think there needs to be a realization that criminal investigations don't happen at the pace that Morse or Law and Order depict them on television. The detail of criminal investigations of this type and the volume of hours and technology assessment and document review required is quite extraordinary. And while it's simplistic and populist to say more should be done and done quicker, it's important to realize that this stuff needs to be done within the established legal principles we have. Fair procedure, beyond reasonable doubt, burden of proof being on the prosecution, and ultimate conviction by a jury of peers. It's important to understand that, because if not, these prosecutions will be done and will be done wrong. It will be Mauritius-like. Nobody wants to see that type of pattern in our prosecution for corporate, regulatory, criminal or corruption-type offences. And I'd say another thing as a prosecutor, just in terms of the timescale, there are many days I stood on my feet prosecuting cases. And what people have to realise is not only do the Gardaí and the prosecutors have to establish the case beyond reasonable doubt, they have to disprove every other single version or story or explanation for what has done. They have to disprove that beyond reasonable doubt as well. And there are many days I'm saying, God, I wish we had more evidence, or we'd explore that line further so we could make what he's now saying is or she is now saying is the explanation look even more ridiculous. You'd only get one bite of the cherry. And therefore, it's important that the painstaking gradual work of getting all of this ready is done and done right. The other thing, and this is here I focus on corruption in particular, and I should say I know nothing or no involvement in any of the case of prosecutions touching on Anglo or any of those wide banking or other controversies. I did, as it happens, because I prosecute in Waterford, I was one of the team involved in the forgery case, about which I'm not going to say anything either, save and perhaps ask people to say an awful lot less about it and be careful what they say about it, because it's another matter that's not resolved in the courts. But on the general point around the crime of corruption, I always say to people, 80–85% of crimes that appear in the list in a place like Waterford plead. And they plead now primarily they plead for a number of reasons. They happen in a public place usually, assaults, batteries, rows on the street. They're witnessed by other persons apart from the victims. And nowadays, they're increasingly witnessed live on CCTV footage. There's CCTV footage zoomed in on 26 of the main streets in Waterford. I always joke with people, if you don't make sure not to get up to anything with anybody but your wife or husband, or you'll be in trouble in Waterford. But that power of that CCTV footage, which is replicated, say, in private CCTV all over our cities, has had a dramatic impact on the rates of pleas, and it's either because jury can see that and make their own judgment, or more likely the Gardaí put this to the person interviewing the person admits to the offence. In crimes, say, like burglary, then something like DNA or forensics will place the burglar in question at or near the scene at the time. And that, again, explains why the plea rate, conviction rate in those types of cases is very high. The very difficult offences to prosecute were firstly rape, but what is colloquially and perhaps wrongly called stranger rape, again something like DNA, which again has transformed criminal investigation, can have an impact. But the hardest ones are the sexual assault or rape cases where the act is admitted, but the consent is at issue. And there is no forensic way to disprove that. There's no CCTV that can prove that. Here you have an encounter which one person says was consensual and the other says was not. And it literally goes in front of the jury as one person's word against the other. It happens usually in very private circumstances. You see the difficulties with that. Well, then take corruption. Corruption, both sides of the encounter deny that it was done or that it was a criminal act. And they literally both say it didn't happen. And that of itself creates further difficulties. That's not saying it's not impossible to prosecute something like corruption cases, ladies and gentlemen, but it's important to realize that unless you completely set aside the concepts of the presumption of innocence beyond reasonable doubt, the burden of proof being on the prosecution, then it's extremely difficult to prosecute these offences, and therefore all the more important that the painstaking investigation work around the circumstances. Again, television often depicts scenarios where a smoking gun is found in one email or one exchange of letters. The real work is involved in looking at hundreds of thousands of emails to find a pattern of behaviour or suggestion around these. Even the whistleblowers and whistleblower protection legislation is all well and good, but there are very few criminal prosecutions can be brought home on the word of whistleblowers, because more often than not, they have another vested interest involved. They have personal reasons why they are confronting. And then people say to me, well, hold on, Noel, the Americans managed to do it. What the Americans do, what the FBI does in gang cases or corruption cases, stuff like that, is it goes in and busts the second in command. They literally go in and they find who's the second or third most important person in this operation. They put him, it's usually him, up against the wall literally and say, right, you squeal, and we'll give you immunity or large or reduced sentence. And then you spill the beans. Whistleblowers are well and good, but it's supergrassers or turned crooks who are the best way to put people away. And I don't think the Irish electorate would necessarily stand, for example, if we were to go into some of the places that have been concerned around the recent controversy and offer the second or third person in charge immunity in return for their version of events, even if you could assume their version of events were reliable in circumstances where they're saving their own skin rather than that of somebody else. Those are just a couple of passing points. I want to leave with one last passing point, and it's this. There is, I think, and I'm very conscious as I say this, that my own initial political background and very general antipathy to Sinn Féin will enable some people to dismiss this, but there is a corruption at the heart of our political system, and there's a moral doublethink at the heart of our political system. The gunmen have been forgiven, and they're now getting the opportunity to benefit from this dark and dangerous economic crisis. That's a significant corruption of the context of our political system, which I think requires more reflection here and elsewhere.